few weeks ago, Libby and I went down to Hoover to watch the SEC baseball tournament. We went specifically to watch the Arkansas Razorbacks. They played the first game and played so well that they were out of the tournament. And so that meant we had the rest of the day to watch all the other teams, and we sat there right in the middle of all the Tennessee fans. And being an Arkansas fan, I'm not necessarily a Tennessee fan, although they're not our biggest rival, right? You don't like Alabama, you don't like LSU, but Tennessee, you're kind of indifferent. And Tennessee's baseball coach is an Arkansan. He came from Arkansas and was on staff there. So, we met some really nice people that root for Tennessee. So I think there are some good Tennessee fans, and we sat there and enjoyed the game. And I will say that having surgery and being laid up at home, it sure is nice to have baseball to watch all the time. So that has been good. There are certain milestones that a player has to reach if he wants to even be considered for the Hall of Fame. So like in baseball, it's generally understood that if you hit 300 for a career, or if you hit 500 home runs or more, or as a pitcher, if you win 300 games, that's at least going to get you on the ballot probably and get you in the discussion. But there are some folks that have gotten into the Hall of Fame because they had one stellar statistical category where they excelled in, but they had glaring weaknesses in their game as well. For instance, Reggie Jackson. Wonderful, terrific, fantastic home run hitter, over 500 home runs in his career. He also struck out 2,597 times. His career batting average is .262, less than stellar. However, as fans, we like home runs, we like the long ball, we like, players that make a big splash. I mean, who cares if they don't play defense? Who cares if they throw it to the other team a lot? Who cares, about any of those things? As long as they do one thing really, really well, we get excited. In the Bible, it seems to be different. It seems that the failures are often highlighted rather than, trying to find the one stellar moment. There is both, but oftentimes we see the failure take front and center, whether that be with Peter or Rahab or some of these other folks that we have been studying throughout this series. And it's understandable why that happens, because we do that in our own spiritual lives, don't we? I mean, we tend to exalt our failures above everything else, and we tend to focus on those at the expense of all the good that we have done, which is why we have been doing this series. And by the way, the never-ending series ends tonight. It's finally over with. But Hebrews 11 is about a group of failures that shows us that failure doesn't have to be final, it doesn't have to be fatal, that it can be an educator, not an undertaker. It's not how far you fall, it's how high you bounce. It's about falling forward. And I love how the Hebrew writer decided that the most important thing about these people is not their failure, but their faith. And if you know anything about the character of Samson, he's a pretty bad guy, right? Samson's not a great guy, really, when you read his story. But yet, there he is, among the list of names of the people who made it into the Faith Hall of Fame. Look with me, Hebrews 11, 32 and following. And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Right alongside such bulwarks of faith like Abraham and David and Noah, there's the name Samson. And again, if you know anything about Samson's story, you know that he was more of a rounder than he was righteous. In fact, when you hear the name Samson, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Hair, right? And strength, which they're both connected, right? Hair, strength. But while Samson was a man of great physical strength, he was a very weak man spiritually. And I'm glad he's included in this list, because I have a hard time relating to Jesus. I know that's who we're supposed to aspire to be, but I have a hard time relating to somebody so perfect. But I can certainly relate to somebody like Samson, somebody who seems to have snuck in at the back door. So let's read Judges chapter 16. If you want to turn there. We're just going to read verse 1 for right now. Judges 16 and verse 1. It says, "Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a prostitute there and had relations with her." That one statement there tells you a whole lot about the character of Samson. This is just the beginning of Samson's downward trajectory. He made a series of bad decisions that led to his demise. Gaza was 25 miles away from Samson's hometown. And assuming that Samson walked it, 25 miles would be somewhere around 82,500 steps. Now understand this. Gaza was the Philistine headquarters, and Samson had no business whatsoever being there. He was public enemy number one. So he was putting his life at risk. Why? Why would this man walk 25 miles just to be with a prostitute? Well, there's your answer, right? We know why. Because we know all about the nature of sin. Maybe we've not done what Samson did, but we know all about instant gratification and how strong the pull is. That we would walk 25 miles or whatever it would be, that we would go to great lengths to acquire whatever it was that would satisfy this insatiable desire for instant gratification. Sin is attractive. It looks good, it tastes good, it feels good. That's why we crave it, and ultimately that's why we engage in it. Samson didn't ruin his life with one bad decision. It took him 82,500 steps. And it's the same with us. We don't ruin our life with one bad decision. It's a series of steps in a bad direction. We find ourselves in spiritual chaos, one bad habit at a time, one decision at a time, one bad step at a time. Turn back to Judges 14. And in Judges chapter 14, verse 3, we also get some insight into the character of Samson. It says, "Then his father and his mother said to him, 'Is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?' But Samson said to his father, 'Get her for me, for she looks good to me.'" Samson had some pretty superficial standards when it came to looking for a wife. Of course, his lust for good-looking women would bring him turmoil later on, something we'll talk about in just a moment. But Samson's primary folly was his failure to live up to his purpose. So we can talk about him going to see a prostitute, we can talk about all these different things, but his primary problem was that he failed to live up to his purpose. Judges chapter 13 tells us that the barren wife of Manoah was mysteriously visited by a messenger of Jehovah who appeared to her in the form of a man. And this messenger informed her that she would conceive a son, and the child would be called Samson. He would be raised a Nazirite, and his role would be to begin the process of delivering Israel from oppression by the Philistines. And because of his special mission, young Samson would be blessed with great strength. Now, it's important to say this from the very beginning. Samson's growing hair would not be the source of his strength, but rather the sign of it. Does that make sense? Because we know the source of his strength, right? Was God. So the hair is not the source of his strength, it's the sign of his strength, but God is the source. Samson was set apart for a special mission, and that mission was to rescue Israel. But his strength came from God. His hair was the sign, but his strength was God. Of course, Samson would fail many times over to live up to his purpose, this special calling that he had been set apart for. For example, he failed to live up to the training that he received as a Nazirite as he involved himself in a wine-drinking feast in Judges 14 and 10. Now, this was a big deal because Nazirites were vowed to stay away from wine and strong drink. And in fact, a Nazirite was not allowed to even touch the skin of a grape. We also know that Samson one time took honey from the carcass of a dead lion. That's another no-no. That rendered him ceremonially unclean. Numbers 6 and verse 6 reads, all the days of his separation to the Lord, he shall not go near to a dead person. And so we know at least two accounts right here where Samson failed miserably. But without a doubt, Samson's career lowlight was his interaction with a woman by the name of Delilah. So let's look there. Judges chapter 16, starting in verse 4. It says, after this it came about that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and see where his great strength lies, and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength is, and how you may be bound to afflict you. Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, then I will become weak and be like any other man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh cords that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in wait in an inner room, and she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the cords as a string of toe snaps when it touches fire. So his strength was not discovered. Then Delilah said to Samson, behold, you have deceived me and told me lies. Now please tell me how you may be bound. And he said to her, if they bind me tightly with new ropes, which have not been used, then I will become weak and be like any other man. So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. For the men were lying in wait in the inner room. But he snapped the ropes from his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, up to now you have deceived me and told me lies. Tell me how you may be bound. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my hair with the web and fasten it with a pin, then I will become weak and be like any other man. So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his hair and wove them into the web. And she fastened it with the pin and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the pin of the loom and the web. So Delilah pulls a Judas, and she decides that she is going to deceive Samson for some silver. But in the beginning, at least, Samson doesn't take the bait. Delilah may be pretty, but her looks can't get Samson to budge. He's not giving away a secret. Then notice verse 15. Then she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have deceived me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength is. It came about when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him that his soul was annoyed to death. So he told her all that was in his heart and said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me and I will become weak and be like any other man. So Delilah lays the guilt trip on him. She presses him daily with her words. Translation, she nagged him. She nagged him to death until he couldn't take it any longer, and so he finally wears down and tells her, and the plan is set in motion. Verse 19, she made him sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his hair. Then she began to afflict him, and his strength left him. She said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. And they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze chains. And he was a grinder in the prison. However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it was shaved off. Now remember, I said that the source of Samson's strength was not his hair, but God. His hair was a sign of his strength, but God was the source of his strength. And why do I say that? Because it says right here, he did not know that the Lord had departed him. So hair was the symbol of his vow, but his strength came from the Spirit of God being upon him. And verse 23 and following reads, now the lords of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. For they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands. When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has given our enemy into our hands, even the destroyer of our country, who has slain many of us. So the Philistines are celebrating. They're rejoicing. Our God beat your God. Our God defeated the God of Israel. Samson's God has been thoroughly defeated by our God, and so they mock him, they ridicule him, they throw him in prison, they revel in their victory. But not so fast. Here's the turning point. Although Samson had messed up the plan, remember the plan was for Samson to deliver Israel. Although he had messed up the plan, God was still working. Notice verses 28 and following. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested and braced himself against them, the one with his right hand and the other with his left. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bent with all his might so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. Then his brothers and all his father's household came down, took him, brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah, his father. Thus he had judged Israel 20 years. So here's a highlight. If we're looking for the good, here is the good. Samson recognized his wrong. He came to his senses, realizing that his strength is in the Lord. He called on God to intervene. And in that moment, I believe that Samson believed in his set-apartness, if that's a word. In his lowest moment, he agreed with God, and he got back to his vow and his purpose. And in his final prayer, Samson invokes 3 different names for God. He appeals to Yahweh, which is the covenant name of the self-existing God. He designates God as Adonai, or Lord, suggestive of the sovereignty or mastery of deity over man. Then he uses the designation Elohim, or God, which likely points to the strength or power of deity. Now, you go to Judges chapter 15, verses 18 through 20, and we see another glimpse of Samson's faith. It says, Then he became very thirsty, and he called to the Lord and said, You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? But God split the hollow place that is in Lehi so that water came out of it. When he drank, his strength returned, and he revived. And therefore he named it En Hakor, which is in Lehi to this day. So he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Can we be honest? If I'm being honest, in his most faithful moments, Samson still seems like a pretty selfish, pretty arrogant guy. Is that just me? I mean, when I read the story, that's what I get. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. It also seems that based on the information that we're presented, Samson lived his whole life as a defiant sinner, but somehow snuck into God's good graces at the very end. I know his dying moments seem to indicate remorse and redemption, but even that feels like a reach. Doesn't it? But who cares? I mean, who cares what I think? Doesn't matter, right? All that matters is what God believes about you. That's it. We can read the story of Samson and we can walk away thinking, oh, that's a pretty bad guy. He's lucky to even be in heaven. It doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter what you think. All that matters is what God thinks of you. God felt that this man, marred by sin, was worthy of induction into the Faith Hall of Fame. Therefore, who am I to judge? Turn over to Romans chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, here's what Paul writes. He says, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. So remember that Paul didn't carry around a Bible like you have. So if they're referring to the Scriptures here, he's referring to what we would call the Old Testament, right? He didn't have the completed New Testament. So the Scriptures he had were what we know as the Old Testament. Now also remember that Paul was a Jew, and so his words and his way of thinking would be connected to his heritage and his ancestry, and that would influence his message, right? So when Paul or the other apostles spoke about Jesus fulfilling the prophecies, they meant that the Messiah fulfilled God's covenant with Israel. And Jesus is representative of fulfilling that covenant with God. He is the merging of both God and Israel. He is fulfilling both God's promises to Israel to save and redeem them, and He's also keeping up Israel's end of the bargain, which was to be faithful unto the point of death to their father. So Jesus sums up the entire story of Israel. Jesus comes to succeed where Israel failed. And He is the culmination of everything that is pointed to this place. And here comes Jesus to fulfill. And this is where you notice some really cool things when you read Scripture in this light. You cannot afford to miss the Old Testament, and you cannot afford to read the Jewishness out of the text. You take pretty much any story within the story of Israel, and you see how Jesus is Israel's God fulfilling that story. Whether it be Joseph or Abraham or David or whoever, you can see how Jesus is similar to that person, but better than that person, right? Take Samson, for example. God used Samson to deliver His people. Samson had a miraculous birth. He had the Spirit of God. Some similarities here with the Messiah, right? However, Samson was a really messed up guy. He was despicable in a lot of ways, but the story of Samson leaves you wanting more. It leaves you waiting for more. It left the people of Israel waiting for more. And then David comes along. You think, okay, David's it. You know, he is the anointed king. He is a Messiah-like figure. So maybe he's the one. I know David had some glaring faults too. David messed up royally, so David's not the better that is to come. But he gives us a hint. He's foreshadowing. And you can do this with so many characters that we read about in the Old Testament. Over and over again, we see in the story of Israel people who seem to be fulfilling the task, but they're not quite there. They're not exactly the one that is to come. They're a type, but they're not Him. They're foreshadowing, but they're not Him. And that's really the theme of the entire New Testament, but definitely the book of Hebrews, is that Jesus is better than. He's better than. All those who came before Him. That's some Messiah-like qualities, but they weren't the Messiah. And that's the encouragement that we get from these flawed heroes. Like Samson. God used him, even when he seemed useless. He finds treasure in the trash. Where we would trim the fat, where we would set a person to the curb, God doesn't. He is going to fulfill His plan. And He can use some pretty unsavory characters to do so. You know, if one sin didn't define David, then it shouldn't define you. If Moses can murder and yet still see heaven, then there's hope for all of us, right? But it starts with faith. That's the signature trait of every one of these characters that we see in Hebrews chapter 11. Inherent within this signature trait of faith is action, because that's what the word inherently means. Faith is about action. It's inherent within the word. And we see it over and over again with these people. Abraham moved, Noah built, Moses led, Gideon fought, Jacob wrestled, Joshua marched. You get the idea. So as people of faith, we have to be people on the move. Faith does not sit. Faith does not soak. Faith does not sour. Faith moves. Saved people save people. Faith motivates. It is a catalyst for everything that we do. Chad did a masterful job last week talking about Matthew chapter 25 and the separating of the sheep and the goats. And if you notice anything about that parable, he brought this to light, but you see that it was all about doing something, wasn't it? That on the day of judgment, at least one of the criteria is going to be, did you do something? And the things that are mentioned that the sheep did were things that we can all do. Right? I mean, there's no excuse. None of us has any excuse not to give the thirsty something to drink or the hungry something to eat. We can all do something. Because faith proves itself in action. Not that you're trying to earn anything, but simply because you have faith. That faith motivates you to be a person of action. I know we talked about Larry Walters, didn't we? I think we did. Larry Walters, the guy that decided he wanted to see his neighborhood from a different perspective. So he strapped himself in a lawn chair and tied weather balloons to it. Then he got at the old Army surplus store and he took with him a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a BB gun. And he thought when he got high enough, he could just shoot out the balloons one by one and he could come down. Little did he know, he got 11,000 feet in the air, right into LAX traffic pattern. They had to shut down the airport. They eventually got him to the ground and cited him heavily. But a reporter asked him, "Were you scared?" And he said, "Yes." "Would you do it again?" He said, "No." "Why did you do it in the first place?" And he said, "Because you can't just sit there. You got to do something, right? You can't just sit there." And the same is true with us. We can't just sit here. We got to do something. Faith is a verb. It moves. It's a call to action. It does something. And look, we've all done some things in the past that we're not proud of. We've all done something that we believe mars our character. Maybe you believe it mars your character so badly that you can never be useful. But nothing could be further from the truth. Paul said, "I'm the chief of sinners," so you can't have that title. He took it. And when you read Hebrews chapter 11, you read about these people and you say to yourself, okay, well, if there's hope for them, there's got to be hope for me. Don't just read it with appreciation. Read it with application. Look at it and say, I want to be those people. I want to be like him, not in their faults, but I want to be like them in their victories. Look, some of you are down and out. Some of you have had a tough time. Some of you have been knocked down by sin. Some of you may be there right now. But look, this is halftime. This isn't the end of the game. This is just halftime. And halftime is a time to reset and rest and refocus and get back into the game, right? This is not the end of the game. This is just halftime. And there have been many teams in the past that were down at halftime and they made adjustments and they ended up winning the game. Now, there were some that were ahead at halftime and ended up losing the game because they didn't adjust well or they just put it on cruise control. Don't do that. But hear me. Keep fighting. I mean, what's the other option? To just drop out? To just quit? Play till the whistle blows. Even though you've been knocked down by sin, even though you feel like you're useless, even though you feel like that God could ever find you as someone that is a valuable resource to Him, that's not true. And don't diminish my God by believing that He can't use you. There are two important dates in your life. You know what the two most important dates in your life are? The day you were born and the day you find out why. The two most important days in your life are the day you're born and the day you find out why. Do you know why you're here? Do you know what your purpose is? Do you know why God has put you on this earth? I was talking to a 99-year-old woman one time, and she was so mad that she was still alive. She goes, "I don't know why He's keeping me alive." And I said, "You might want to figure that out." Because as long as you're vertical and ventilating, you have a purpose. Figure out that purpose and live it out. And when you fall, get back up. When you fail, get back up. Keep playing till the whistle blows. This is halftime. Game's not over yet. Do you need help? The wonderful thing about the Christian church is that we can pick you up when you fall. We can carry you if we need to. The Lord's church functions as an army that helps its casualties. Maybe you're hurting. Maybe you're in need. Maybe the devil has had his way with you and you're ready to start a life of discipleship this evening. Certainly, we can take care of that as well. Whatever your need is, let us help you. And don't leave here tonight without being right with God. Why don't you come as Jake leads us in a song?